Snow fell like cold ash over the Ardennes. December 1944 had brought with it a silence that did not belong to that war. A silence stretched over the black pines and frozen valleys like a white shroud. There were no engines, no screams, no distant thunder of artillery that had shaken the days before. Only the cutting wind, only the faint creak of snow gathering on metal. Inside the M10 Wolverine, Elias Hart watched through the periscope, his eyes fixed on a horizon that refused to move. Through the narrow lens, the world was reduced to shades of grey and white, a landscape closer to a faded photograph than a battlefield. He did not blink, he could not. Every movement was a risk, every second of distraction, a possibility of death. The cold pierced through layers of wool and leather, numbing his fingers, turning breath into mist that vanished in the frozen air. Beside him, Eddie Nolan stamped his feet against the steel floor to keep blood flowing. The sound was muffled, almost pitiful. Eddie was too young for this, Elias thought. They all were. But Eddie had that look, the one of someone who hadn't yet understood that war did not wait for anyone to grow up. His lips were cracked. He bit the lower one until it bled, a nervous tic that had deepened over 3 silent days. 3 days without radio contact, 3 days waiting for orders that never came, 3 days watching an empty forest that could be full of enemies or ghosts. By now the difference felt meaningless. Captain Mason Price's command still echoed like a mantra in Elias's mind. No orders, no fire. Observe, report, do not engage. The words were clear, almost comforting in their certainty. Price was a man of rules, of straight lines and clean logic. He believed discipline was the thin wire separating soldiers from murderers. Elias respected that, or at least he had tried to. But here, beneath this weight of white silence, the order itself began to feel heavier than the gun. What did obedience mean when no one could hear? What did waiting mean when time had frozen solid? Somewhere outside, a tree cracked under the weight of snow, a sharp or hollow sound swallowed instantly by the wind. Eddie flinched. Elias did not. He kept watching, counting, breathing through the cold. And there, in that December of ice and fog, something began, something no manual had prepared him for. The quiet war inside a man forced to choose between duty and conscience. The snow kept falling. The silence kept watch. The briefing had taken place 4 days earlier, in a farmhouse that still smelled of bread and burnt wood. Captain Mason Price stood before a map pinned to a cracked wall, his finger tracing the serpentine roads through the Ardennes forest. Outside, the first snow had begun to fall. Elias remembered the way Price's voice cut through the room, steady, methodical, stripped of anything that resembled doubt. He spoke the way engineers drew blueprints, with absolute precision. "You will position here," Price said, tapping a junction marked in red pencil. "Observe all movement along this corridor. Report coordinates. Do not, under any circumstances, engage without direct authorization." The room was crowded with men who smelled of diesel and exhaustion. Some nodded. Others stared at the map as if it were a foreign language. Eddie shifted his weight from foot to foot, his hands buried in his pockets. Price continued. His words were not suggestions. They were architecture. "Intelligence believes the enemy is consolidating forces east of Bastogne. If they push through this gap, the entire sector collapses. Your job is not to stop them. Your job is to see them coming." Elias had pulled out his notebook then, a small oil-stained thing he'd carried since basic training. He wrote in shorthand, distances, angles, elevation changes, sight lines. Numbers were clean. Numbers did not lie or hesitate or second-guess themselves. His father had taught him that years ago in a garage in Pennsylvania, where engines were rebuilt with patience and math. Price noticed the notebook. He did not smile. But something shifted in his expression, a flicker of approval or perhaps recognition. "Good," he said. "How precision matters more than courage out there," Eddie had whispered later as they loaded gear into the Wolverine. "What if we see them and can't reach command?" Elias did not answer. He was calculating fuel consumption, ammunition load, optimal firing positions. The question felt premature, hypothetical. Now 3 days into the silence, it no longer felt hypothetical. Inside the frozen hull of the tank destroyer, Eddie broke the quiet with a low, frustrated exhale. "We should move," he said. Find higher ground. Try the radio again. Elias kept his eye pressed to the periscope. Captain said, hold position. Captain's not here. That's why we hold. Eddie was quiet for a moment. Then, what if he's wrong? It was a dangerous question, the kind that unraveled the threads holding men together in war. Orders were not meant to be questioned. They were meant to be anchored to like ropes in a storm. But Elias had felt it too. The gnawing sense that the silence was not empty, that something vast and iron was moving through the fog beyond the range of their vision, and that waiting might be the most fatal decision of all. He thought of his father again, the way the old man would pause mid-repair, wrench in hand, listening to an engine's rhythm. "So you don't just follow the manual," his father had said once. "You listen. The machine tells you what it needs." But this was not a machine. This was war. And war had manuals for a reason. Eddie rubbed his hands together, breath clouding in the cramped space. "I'm scared, Elias." Elias finally looked away from the periscope. Eddie's face was pale, younger than it had been 4 days ago. "Me too," Elias said quietly. It was the first time he had admitted it out loud. The wind picked up outside, howling through the trees. Somewhere in the distance, faint, almost imagined, there was a sound. Low, mechanical, rhythmic. Elias returned to the periscope, his pulse suddenly loud in his ears. The forest was still empty, but the silence had changed. It came through the fog like a nightmare given form. At first, Elias thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow moving wrong, a distortion in the pale grey curtain that had settled over the valley. He adjusted the periscope, wiped condensation from the eyepiece with his thumb, and looked again. The shadow had shape now. Mass. Purpose. A Tiger tank emerged from the tree line, its angular hull black against the snow. Behind it, like iron disciples, came the Panzer IVs, 4, maybe 5, moving in staggered formation. They advanced slowly, deliberately, their tracks chewing through the frozen earth with a sound like distant thunder. Elias's breath caught. Eddie heard it in the silence. "What is it?" "Contact." The word came out flat, drained of inflection. "Armor column. Eastern approach." Eddie scrambled to his position, peering through the gunner's sight. Jesus Christ! The column moved with terrible patience, turrets scanning the tree line, searching for threats that had not yet revealed themselves. They were less than 2,000 yards out, close enough to count hatches, close enough to see the exhaust vapor trailing behind them like breath. Elias's hand moved automatically to his notebook, fingers numb but functional. He wrote, 1847 hours, enemy armor, Tiger I plus 4X Panzer A4, bearing 087, speed 8 kph, range 1950 YDS. The numbers steadied him, gave him something solid to hold. He reached for the radio, already knowing what he would find. Static. The same static that had filled the channel for 3 days. He cycled through frequencies, tried the backup channel, adjusted the gain. Nothing. The world beyond their metal shell had gone deaf. Eddie's voice was tight, strangled. "We need to pull back. Now." "And go where?" Elias did not look away from the periscope. "Guys, they're between us and the rally point. Then we wait, we hide, If they pass through this gap, they reach the main road in 20 minutes. Elias's mind was already calculating trajectories, angles of approach, kill zones. Bastogne is 40 minutes beyond that. Eddie understood. His face went pale. How many men are in Bastogne? Enough to matter. The Tiger led the column with the confidence of a creature that had no natural predators. Its 80mm gun could punch through their armor like paper. One shot. That's all it would take. The Wolverine was fast, lightly armored, designed to strike and vanish, but there was nowhere to vanish to. Elias measured distances in his mind, overlaying the terrain with calculations he'd memorized from 1,000 drills. First shot at 1,800 yards. Flank angle optimal. Aim for the third vehicle. Disable the center. Create chaos. Force the column to halt. But Captain Price's words pressed against his thoughts like a physical weight. Do not engage without direct authorization. The right decision was clear. Observe, record, survive to report. That was doctrine. That was discipline. That was the difference between a soldier and a fool. But doctrine had not accounted for this, for the silence, for the isolation, for the terrible mathematics of consequence. If he waited, if he obeyed, the column would pass, and men would die because he had followed orders. If he fired, he would be acting without authority, without confirmation, without the chain of command that separated war from murder. He would be gambling everything on his own judgment, the judgment of a 23-year-old artilleryman from Pennsylvania, who fixed engines with his father and believed that numbers never lied. Eddie watched him, waiting for a decision that neither of them was qualified to make. Elias's hand moved to the firing mechanism. His finger hovered over the trigger, suspended between obedience and necessity, between the rules that defined him and the conscience that would not stay silent. The Tiger's turret rotated slowly, scanning the ridge where they sat hidden beneath snow and camouflage netting. The world held its breath, and Elias' heart, for the first time in his life, understood that courage was not the absence of fear. It was the terrible weight of choosing when all choices carried death. The decision did not feel like a decision. It felt like falling. Elias's finger closed on the trigger, and the world detonated. The recoil slammed through the Wolverine like a heartbeat made of steel. The blast tore the silence open, a single roar that erased thought, hesitation, and fear. The shell crossed the valley in a blink, and the impact came like thunder. Through the periscope, Elias saw the third German tank bloom into fire. Flames coiled upward, orange against the snow, black smoke twisting into the gray sky. The explosion echoed through the forest, swallowed and thrown back by the cold air. For a heartbeat, everything froze. Engines stopped. Men shouted in confusion. The column had become a line of blind giants, unsure which way to turn. Elias didn't wait. "Left," he ordered. Eddie's hands shook, but the turret turned, slow, heavy, inevitable. The next shot struck the second tank in its side. It lurched, wheezing smoke, crew spilling out into the snow like shadows. The Tiger at the head of the line growled to life, its engine low and furious. It turned, searching the trees, hunting the ghost that had broken its silence. "Reverse!" Elias shouted. Eddie slammed the controls. The Wolverine jolted backward, snow and dirt kicking beneath the tracks. A shell screamed past, tearing a tree apart where they'd been seconds before. The forest exploded with noise, splintering wood, echoing metal, the sound of men yelling orders they could no longer hear. 2 o'clock, Elias said, his voice calm amid the chaos. He fired again. Another tank burst open like a tin can crushed by an invisible hand. Eddie was breathing hard, half laughing, half crying. "They're everywhere," he said. Elias didn't answer. His hands moved automatically, reloading, repositioning. He fired at the Tiger's flank, the one place even its armor couldn't save it. The shot landed. The great machine shuddered, its track snapping loose. It tried to move but only groaned, stuck halfway between power and ruin. Smoke spread through the forest. The Germans were shouting now, panicking, firing blind into the trees. They thought they were surrounded. They weren't. There was only one gun, one man, and a silence that had learned to speak through fire. The forest burned like a forge. Elias moved the Wolverine through smoke and snow, each motion measured and deliberate. He didn't think. He calculated by instinct. Every shot a line of geometry drawn through chaos. Eddie loaded the shells without words. His terror had hardened into focus. Each time the gun roared, the tank shuddered like a living thing. Outside, the Germans tried to regroup, their voices lost in the rising firestorm. One panzer crawled out from behind a barn, black and scarred. Elias fired before it even cleared the smoke. The explosion came a moment later, a rolling wave that swallowed the world in orange and ash. Only the Tiger remained, wounded, angry, still dangerous. It turned slowly, turret grinding, its gun like an eye searching for vengeance. Elias circled wide, using wreckage and smoke as cover. The smell of fuel and snow filled the air, sweet, metallic, unbearable. Through the haze, he saw figures climbing from the Tiger, shouting, trying to repair its broken track. He steadied his breathing, felt the weight of the trigger beneath his glove, and fired again. The shell struck true. The turret locked, jammed at an awkward angle. Inside, flames began to bloom, dim at first, then fierce. The crew fled into the snow, their shouts lost to the roar of fire. Then it was quiet again. Not peace, never peace, but the heavy quiet that follows after everything has been said. Eddie stared through the periscope, his breath trembling. 5 tanks burned in the valley below. Smoke rose in pillars, black against the white sky. He laughed, high and broken, half madness, half relief. "We did it," he said. "God, we actually did it." Elias didn't reply. He was listening to something deeper, beyond the sound of fire. A low rumble, far off, moving closer. Engines, more of them. He checked his remaining shells. Just a few. Eddie saw the look on his face. The joy drained away. "What now?" he asked. Elias didn't answer. He just looked at the burning forest, the wreckage, the ghosts. The Wolverine's engine groaned as it began to move again, slow and wounded. As night fell, the Wolverine dragged itself back through smoke and snow, a spectre moving toward the living. The base at Bastogne smelled of diesel and desperation. Elias and Eddie arrived at dawn, the Wolverine trailing smoke, its armor scorched black, its gun barrels still warm. Men stared as they passed. Word had already spread, rumors moving faster than radio signals ever could. Captain Mason Price waited in the command tent, standing before the same map that had hung in the farmhouse 4 days earlier. He did not turn when Elias entered, did not acknowledge the sound of boots on frozen ground. "Sit," Price said. Elias sat. Eddie remained outside, dismissed with a gesture. Price finally turned. His face was unreadable, neither angry nor approving, a mask of military discipline that revealed nothing. He held a report in his hand, typewritten, still smudged with carbon. 5 enemy vehicles destroyed, estimated 40 enemy casualties. German advance through Sector 7 halted for 6 hours. Price's voice was flat, clinical. "You fired without orders, without authorization, without communication." "Yes, sir." "You disobeyed a direct command." "Yes, sir." Price set the report down. He studied Elias with the same calculating precision Elias had used to measure trajectories. 2 men trained in different forms of mathematics, trying to solve the same impossible equation. Why? It was not the question Elias expected. He had prepared himself for court-martial, for consequences, for the machinery of military justice. But Price wanted something else. Wanted to understand. Elias chose his words carefully. "The orders came too late, sir. By the time communication would have been restored, the column would have been through. I calculated the risk. You calculated." Price's expression shifted slightly, not quite a smile, but something close to recognition. "And what did your calculations tell you about the consequences of acting without authority? That some men would call it courage, others would call it mutiny. Both would be correct." Price was silent for a long moment. Outside, the camp continued its morning routine. Engines starting, voices calling, the organized chaos of war. Inside the tent, 2 men sat in the space between judgment and understanding. 3 hours after your engagement," Price said quietly, "a company of paratroopers moving through that sector reported the road clear. They made it to their position because you removed the obstacle." He paused. "They're calling you the ghost of the forest. The invisible battalion." Elias said nothing. Price picked up the report again, studied it as if seeing it for the first time. "The problem, Sergeant Hart, is that we cannot afford soldiers who think for themselves, and we cannot afford soldiers who don't." He looked up. "You put me in an impossible position." "I know, sir." "No, you don't." Price's voice hardened. "Because now I have to decide whether to punish the action or learn from it." The tent flap opened. A lieutenant entered, young and breathless. "Sir, the paratroopers are here. They're asking to see the crew from the ridge." Price dismissed him with a nod. He turned back to Elias. "You're not a hero, Sergeant. You're a problem I don't know how to solve." He handed Elias the report. "But you're a problem that saved lives." Price walked toward the exit, then stopped, dismissed. "And Hart, sir, next time you decide to calculate consequences, Factor in that some of us might actually learn something. The archive room in Washington smelled of old paper and fluorescent light. Dr. Samuel Ava sat at a metal desk, surrounded by boxes marked with dates and classification stamps that had faded to ghosts of their former authority. Outside, the city moved at modern speed. Inside, time had collapsed into folders and photographs, and the careful handwriting of men long dead. He found the file by accident, or perhaps by the kind of patient searching that eventually resembles fate. Hart, Elias J., Sergeant, 702nd Tank Destroyer Battalion, Ardennes Sector, December 1944. The report was brief, clinical in its language, but Ava had learned to read between the lines of military documentation. What the words did not say was often more important than what they did. Unauthorized engagement, 5 enemy vehicles destroyed, action taken without command approval, tactical success, disciplinary review, inconclusive. That word carried weight. It meant the army had not known whether to punish or promote him, whether to court-martial a man for insubordination or study his methods for future doctrine. They had chosen the latter. Ava pulled out another document, a tactical manual dated 1947, 3 years after the engagement. Section 14, Asymmetrical Engagement Sequencing. The methodology was technical, stripped of personality, converted into diagrams and formulas. But Ava recognized its origin. He had seen the same calculations in Hart's notebook, preserved in another file, its pages still stained with oil and snow. One man's disobedience had become doctrine. One moment of calculation under fire had been transformed into something teachable, repeatable, institutional. But the man himself had vanished into footnotes. Ava recorded his findings into a small digital recorder, his voice quiet in the empty room. Hart's action at the Ardennes represents a paradox at the heart of military ethics. He violated orders to fulfill the spirit of those orders. He acted alone, but saved many. He was never decorated, never promoted beyond sergeant. The army learned from him but never acknowledged him. He paused, searching for the right words. Perhaps that was intentional. Perhaps they understood that to celebrate him would be to encourage the very thing they feared most, soldiers who thought for themselves in the moment of crisis. Ava found one more document, a death certificate. Elias Hart, 1981, pneumonia, buried at Arlington with military honors, but without fanfare. A simple stone, a simple inscription. He did what had to be done. Ava closed the files. He would write his paper. He would present his findings at the Conference on Military Ethics and Tactical Evolution. Hart's story would be told, in academic language, to people who had never felt the cold of the Ardennes or the weight of impossible decisions. But standing there in that archive room, surrounded by the dust of forgotten wars, Ava understood something that would never make it into his paper. Courage was not the sound of guns. It was the silence before the first shot, the moment between obedience and conscience, the terrible mathematics of choosing when all choices carried cost. Elias Hart had lived in that silence, had made his calculation, had fired, and the world, in its way, had learned. Outside, snow began to fall over Washington, light, almost imperceptible, the kind that would melt before morning. Inside, Dr. Ava gathered his files and prepared to leave. The archive room fell silent, and somewhere in that silence, if you listened carefully enough, you could still hear the echo of a single shot fired 70 years ago in a frozen forest, a shot that had never really stopped reverberating. The snow kept falling. The silence kept its secrets. And history, patient and implacable, continued its long work of remembering what men tried to forget,